The afternoon sun shone brightly on the polished glass windows of the luxury car dealership. Inside, rows of gleaming cars stood like silent statues, sleek, shining, and expensive. The air smelled of new leather and fresh polish, and soft music played in the background as well-dressed salesmen moved about, chatting with rich customers who walked in with pride and confidence. Then the glass doors slid open and a tall man walked in quietly. It was Big Shaq. He wore a plain hoodie, old jeans, and sneakers that looked slightly worn. His walk was calm, his face relaxed. He didn't carry the energy of someone trying to impress anyone. He just strolled slowly between the rows of luxury cars, running his hand gently along the smooth paint of a black sports car, looking at the details like a man who understood them deeply. But to the dealership manager, he looked like nothing more than a random man wasting time. From his glass office on the second floor, the manager spotted Shaq the moment he stepped in. The manager was a man who judged people quickly. He believed he could tell who had money just by looking at their clothes. Seeing Shaq's casual outfit, he frowned instantly. To him, customers were only worth his time if they wore suits, watches, and expensive shoes. The manager came down the stairs with fast steps, his face tight. He didn't smile. He didn't even greet Shaq politely. He just walked straight up to him and said loudly, "Can I help you with something, or are you just looking around?" Shaq smiled slightly. "Just looking for now." The manager's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "Looking? Do you know how much these cars cost?" A few nearby customers turned their heads. Some of the salesmen pretended not to watch, but they were listening. They could hear the cold tone in the manager's voice. It was sharp, like he was trying to embarrass Shaq. "These are luxury models," the manager continued. "They're not cheap." Shaq stayed calm. "I know." The manager laughed softly, but not in a kind way. It was the kind of laugh people give when they think they're better than you. "Sir, maybe you should check the used car lot down the street. This place is not for everyone." The words floated in the air, heavy and insulting. Shaq looked around for a moment. Everyone was pretending to focus on their own business, but he could feel their eyes. A few even smirked, as if they had already judged him the way the manager had. He stayed silent. There was no anger in his eyes, just something quiet, something deeper. The manager stepped closer, lowering his voice but still sharp. "I'll have to ask you to leave. We have serious buyers here, and I don't want anyone disturbing them." Shaq nodded slowly. "All right." He gave one last look at the shining cars, then at the people watching him. Not one person tried to stop the manager. Not one person spoke up. He simply turned around and walked out of the glass doors, his footsteps steady and calm. The soft music inside started playing again, and people went back to their conversations as if nothing had happened. The manager stood there with a proud little smile, brushing invisible dust off his suit jacket. In his mind, he had done the right thing, protected the dealership's image, kept out someone who didn't belong there. What he didn't know was that the man he had just kicked out was not only richer than every customer inside, but he actually owned the entire dealership. As Shaq stepped outside, the warm air hit his face. He paused by his car, a simple black SUV parked near the curb. He placed his hands on the roof, breathing slowly. He wasn't angry. He had seen this kind of judgment many times before, people deciding who he was just by looking at him, by measuring his worth in clothes and appearances. But this time something inside him stirred. This place wasn't just another dealership. It was one of the businesses he had quietly invested in years ago through his holding company. He had stayed invisible in the background, letting others run it. He had trusted that they would treat people with respect. Clearly he had been wrong. He opened the car door, sat down, and closed it gently. The hum of the city outside faded. He sat in silence for a long moment, thinking. The manager had looked at him like he was small. Like he was nothing. That wasn't what hurt him. What hurt him was seeing how quickly everyone else had joined in with their silence, how easy it was for people to believe someone wasn't worthy just because they didn't look wealthy. Shaq pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found a name, his legal advisor. He stared at the name for a moment, then pressed call. As the line rang, his lips curled into the faintest smile. If the manager thought he had seen the last of him, he was about to learn the biggest lesson of his life. The next morning, the dealership was buzzing with its usual rhythm. Sunlight streamed through the tall glass windows, bouncing off the polished hoods of luxury cars lined in perfect symmetry. Salesmen wore their sharp suits and practiced smiles, ready to impress the wealthy customers who came and went like royalty. And then once again the glass doors slid open, and Big Shaq walked back inside. This time he walked slower, calm, confident, and silent. His same casual hoodie, the same worn sneakers, the same peaceful eyes. He moved as if he belonged there, though no one believed he did. The receptionist stiffened slightly. She remembered him from yesterday. So did the salesman. They shared quick glances, whispering under their breath. And from his glass office on the second floor, the manager spotted him instantly. A thin smile curled across the manager's face. He didn't see a man quietly looking at cars. He saw an intruder returning to make a fool of himself. And this time he decided to humiliate him completely, publicly, so that everyone could see what happens to people like him when they step into places they don't belong. The manager strode down the stairs, shoes clicking against the marble floor. He clapped his hands loudly to get attention, making everyone look up. "Excuse me," he called out, raising his voice so it echoed off the glass walls. "Ladies and gentlemen, can I have your attention for just a moment?" People paused. Some stopped mid-conversation. A couple of customers even looked annoyed at being interrupted. The manager walked directly toward Shaq, who was standing quietly by a gleaming red sports car, admiring its curves like an artist studying a painting. "This man," the manager announced loudly, pointing at him, "came here yesterday pretending to be a serious buyer. But let's be honest, does he look like someone who can afford even the tires on this car?" A few nervous chuckles spread through the room. Some people smiled awkwardly, unsure whether to laugh or stay silent. The salesman froze, wide-eyed, not daring to say anything. Shaq didn't move. His hands were in his pockets. His face was calm, almost too calm. The manager circled him like a performer on a stage. "Sir," he said in a loud, mocking tone, "maybe you didn't hear me the first time. These cars are not for window shoppers. They're for real buyers, people who belong in places like this." He leaned closer, lowering his voice but keeping it sharp enough for everyone to hear. "This is not a photo booth. It's a luxury dealership. So unless you've won the lottery overnight, I suggest you step out before you waste anyone else's time." The words landed like stones in the quiet room. Shaq slowly turned his eyes from the car to the manager. There was no anger in them, just something unreadable. Something that made the manager pause for half a second, then shake it off and smirk again. "I'm serious," the manager said, puffing out his chest. "Security will be here in a moment if you don't walk out on your own." A couple of customers were now watching openly, whispering. One man laughed and muttered, "Guess he's in the wrong place." Shaq gave a small nod. "All right," he said softly, his voice low but clear. He stepped away from the car. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He just turned and walked toward the door. Each step was slow, steady, and silent, but somehow heavier than the manager expected, like the steps of someone who carried something powerful behind him. The glass doors opened, and the sunlight outside spilled across the floor as Shaq walked out. Inside, the dealership seemed to breathe again. Conversations picked up. The salesman moved on, pretending to be busy. The manager stood tall in the center of the room, straightening his tie with pride. He thought he had done something impressive, something bold. He looked around as if waiting for applause. "That," he said to no one in particular, "is how you protect your brand." A couple of the younger salesmen gave small, hesitant smiles. They didn't really agree with what he had done, but they were afraid to show it. The manager, feeling powerful, climbed back up the stairs to his glass office, his chest puffed like a peacock. He felt like a hero in his own story, a man who had shown strength by keeping someone unworthy out. But outside the dealership, Big Shaq leaned against his black SUV, slipping on a pair of sunglasses as the warm wind brushed across his face. He wasn't angry. Not even close. He had faced worse insults before. He had grown used to people underestimating him, used to being judged by clothes, by tone, by silence. But this felt different. Because the man who had tried to make him feel small didn't realize something important. Shaq owned this place. Not just the building. Not just the cars. The entire business. He had quietly purchased a majority stake years ago through his investment company, keeping his name off the public records, letting a team run the daily operations. He had stayed silent in the background because he believed people could be trusted to treat others with kindness even when no one was watching. Clearly he had been wrong. And now, the man who thought he was powerful was about to learn just how powerless pride becomes when the truth steps into the room. Shaq opened his car door, sat inside, and pulled out his phone. His legal advisor answered on the first ring. "It's time," Shaq said simply. "Time for what?" the advisor asked. Shaq smiled faintly. "Time to remind them who really owns this place." He ended the call and stared at the tall glass building through the windshield. Inside, the manager was still smiling, still proud, still unaware that the world he thought he controlled was about to flip upside down. And this time the whole world would be watching. The dealership looked quiet from the outside, but inside, its walls carried whispers. Salesmen moved like chess pieces, following rules and watching their manager like he was the king of the board. Yet outside, sitting calmly inside his black SUV, Big Shaq was already planning the first move of his own silent game. He didn't storm back in. He didn't shout or threaten anyone. He simply sat still, the soft hum of the air conditioner the only sound around him, while his eyes stared at the tall glass building like a man staring at a locked safe he already had the key for. He opened his phone and sent a single message to his private assistant. Pull everything on the dealership. Staff, contracts, profits, manager. Full report. The reply came seconds later. On it. That night, long after the dealership closed its doors and the glowing lights went dark, Shaq sat alone in his study. The room was quiet except for the soft click of his laptop keys. His assistant had sent him a thick folder of information, and now he was peeling back every layer of it like someone slowly unwrapping a secret. There it was. The company registration showing his investment firm as the majority shareholder. The board reports. The staff list. And there, on the last few pages, the manager's record. Shaq leaned back in his chair, eyebrows raised slightly. The manager's name was Richard Collins. A man who had worked there for 8 years, starting as a salesman, climbing the ranks fast. He was known for aggressive deals, strict rules, and a zero-tolerance attitude. But between the numbers, Shaq saw something else. A trail of complaints quietly buried. A few ex-employees had reported him for verbal abuse. Some had said he was ruthless with customers who didn't look rich enough. A couple of reviews online even mentioned him humiliating people publicly, mocking their clothes or accents. The company had never acted on it. Maybe they were afraid of him. Maybe they just didn't care. But Shaq cared. Not because of what Richard had done to him, Shaq could take an insult and walk away. But because of what Richard might be doing to others who couldn't walk away. People who needed jobs. People who saved for years just to walk through those glass doors, only to be treated like they didn't belong. Shaq closed the laptop slowly and stared at the reflection of himself in the dark screen. He thought of the kid he used to be, the one who wore the same shoes for 2 years, who was told he'd never be more than a tall, quiet nobody. He had promised himself long ago that if he ever built something big, he would make sure people inside it were treated with respect. No matter what they wore, no matter where they came from. And now he knew exactly what he had to do. The next morning, while the city was still rubbing sleep from its eyes, Shaq's team quietly moved into action. They contacted the dealership's regional office. They froze Richard's access to high-level financial files. They placed a subtle flag on the internal HR system, so any complaint filed against Richard would come straight to Shaq's inbox. And most importantly, they scheduled a board meeting for the following afternoon, without telling Richard who had called it. Shaq didn't want revenge. He wanted reality. He wanted the truth of Richard's behavior laid bare in front of everyone who thought he was untouchable. That afternoon, Shaq dressed differently. No hoodie. No sneakers. He wore a clean black suit, not loud, not flashy, just sharp. A quiet kind of powerful. He drove back to the dealership with his tinted windows rolled down, the warm breeze brushing his face. When he stepped out of the SUV, he didn't walk like a man visiting a showroom. He walked like someone walking toward his own house. Inside, Richard was busy bragging to a wealthy couple about their latest luxury model. He didn't notice Shaq at first. The receptionist did, and her eyes went wide. Shaq just smiled politely and walked past her, heading upstairs to the glass meeting room where the company board had gathered quietly. Every head turned when he entered. Some were surprised. Some were nervous. One man whispered, "That's him, the majority owner." Shaq simply nodded, taking his seat at the head of the table like he had been there 1,000 times. Through the glass walls below, Richard finally noticed him. His face froze. For the first time, his smile faltered. He excused himself from the couple mid-sentence and rushed toward the stairs, confusion sharpening every step. By the time he reached the meeting room, the door was already closed. Inside, Shaq calmly opened a folder and placed it on the table. Pages of reports, complaints, and staff testimonies spilled across the glass. "Before we start," Shaq said softly, "I want you all to know something." Everyone leaned in. The room was silent. "Yesterday, I walked into this place as an ordinary man," he said. "And I was treated like I was invisible. Like I was worthless. That doesn't bother me. I've been underestimated my whole life. But what does bother me, is that I'm not the first person this manager has done it to. And if nothing changes, I won't be the last." His words landed like thunder rolling slowly through the air. No one spoke. Not yet. But every person in that room knew something big had just shifted, and that Richard Collins's empire of pride was about to crumble from the inside out. Outside the glass, Richard stood frozen, staring at them, still clueless that the man he had thrown out was not only back, but about to decide his future. The glass door opened with a slow, quiet hiss. Richard stepped in, his shoes clicking sharply on the polished floor, the sound almost too loud for the tension in the air. He looked around at the long table where the board members sat, their faces unreadable, and then his eyes landed on the man at the head of the table, the same man he had mocked and thrown out only a day ago. Big Shaq. But this Shaq was different. He wasn't wearing the loose hoodie or the worn sneakers from yesterday. He was dressed in a black tailored suit that seemed to carry its own gravity. His posture was calm, steady, but his presence filled the room like a silent storm about to break. Richard blinked, confused, forcing a half-smile. What's going on here?" he asked, trying to sound casual, though his voice cracked slightly. No one answered. Shaq didn't look up right away. He slowly closed the folder in front of him, like someone finishing the last move in a long, patient game of chess. Then he lifted his eyes and met Richard's. "Sit down," Shaq said. It wasn't loud. It wasn't threatening. But it made Richard's knees feel weaker than they had in years. He sat. The silence in the room was heavy, almost physical. One of the senior executives cleared his throat, but Shaq spoke first. "Yesterday," Shaq began, "I walked into this dealership like any other customer. No appointment. No suit. No luxury car pulling up to announce me. And you," he paused, looking directly at Richard, "decided I wasn't worth your time." Richard shifted in his seat, his forced smile fading. "With respect," he said quickly, "we get a lot of people wasting our time." "You looked like I didn't belong," Shaq finished for him, his voice soft but sharp. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it again. Shaq turned his attention to the board. "What none of you knew is that I've been watching this dealership for months. Not just as a customer, but as its owner." A ripple moved through the room like wind through dry leaves. A couple of board members exchanged stunned looks. Richard's head jerked back as if he'd been slapped. "Owner?" he repeated, almost a whisper. Shaq reached into the folder and slid a set of documents across the table. The company registration papers gleamed under the light, each page stamped with his holding company's seal, each line showing the truth. Shaq was the majority shareholder. He had been the boss all along. Richard stared at the papers as if they were written in fire. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The man who always had something clever to say, had nothing. "I could have fired you the moment I stepped back into this building," Shaq continued quietly. "I could have replaced you overnight. But instead, I wanted to see how far your pride would go." Shaq leaned forward now, his eyes locking on Richard's with quiet intensity. "You judged me without knowing me. You embarrassed me in front of your staff and your customers. Not because I was rude. Not because I broke any rules. But because I didn't look rich enough for your respect." Each word landed like a hammer wrapped in silk. Richard swallowed hard. I didn't know. That's the problem," Shaq cut in, his voice rising just enough to silence the room. "You didn't care to know." The room stayed still, every heartbeat loud. Then Shaq stood up. His tall frame seemed even taller now, towering not just over Richard but over everything Richard had built on arrogance. "Let me tell you something," Shaq said, his tone softening but not losing its weight. "When I was younger, people treated me the same way. I walked into places and they told me I didn't belong. I wore cheap clothes. I had nothing. And I promised myself, if I ever made it big, I would never forget what that felt like." He pointed gently at the table, at the papers, at the dealership's logo printed on the folder. "This place will not become another place that makes people feel small. Not while it has my name on it. Not while I'm the one who signs the paychecks." For a moment, even the air seemed to hold still. Richard lowered his eyes. His voice, when it came, was no longer confident. It was small. I'm sorry." Shaq studied him for a long moment. Then he spoke again, calmly. "I'm not here to destroy you, Richard. I'm here to change this place. But if you want to stay here, you're going to have to change too." Shaq sat back down slowly, the storm inside him settling. "This is your choice," he said. "You can walk out that door now and never come back. Or you can stay, learn how to treat every person with respect, and rebuild your reputation from the ground up. But make no mistake, this dealership will be known for kindness, not arrogance. And if you get in the way of that, you won't last here." The words hung in the air like the echo of distant thunder. Richard nodded shakily. I want to stay. I'll change." Shaq didn't smile, but he gave a single nod. Then prove it, he said. That moment marked the exact second when the power in the room shifted. The man who had strutted like a king yesterday now sat humbled, quiet, unsure. And the man who had been mocked and dismissed was now the true ruler of the room, without raising his voice, without showing anger, only by revealing the truth. Richard had come to the table thinking he was in charge. He left knowing he had just been given the rarest thing of all, a second chance from the man he had underestimated. The meeting room door opened slowly and Richard stepped out first. He didn't look like the same man who had walked in. His back wasn't as straight, his chin not as high. He walked like someone carrying an invisible weight. The staff on the sales floor turned their heads as he passed, puzzled by the sudden stillness on his face. Then Big Shaq walked out behind him. And this time people noticed. The same man they had seen yesterday, brushed off, laughed at, pushed out like a stranger, now walked through the glass corridor in a crisp suit, flanked by the dealership's senior executives. His steps were slow, calm, deliberate. Not the walk of a visitor. The walk of someone who belonged. The air inside the showroom changed. It was like everyone could feel something big had just shifted, even if they didn't yet know what it was. The receptionist, who had seen everything yesterday, pressed her lips together to hide her smile. One of the mechanics dropped his wrench in surprise when Shaq gave him a nod of acknowledgement while passing by. Shaq stopped in the middle of the showroom floor. The luxury cars around him gleamed under the bright lights, but everyone's eyes were on him now. He turned slowly, letting the silence settle before he spoke. "Can I have everyone's attention, please?" Shaq said in a calm, steady voice. The chatter stopped instantly. Phones were lowered. Every staff member, from the finance office to the cleaning crew, gathered around. "Most of you don't know who I am," Shaq continued, his voice carrying easily through the quiet room. "Yesterday, I came here dressed like any ordinary man. I wanted to see how this place treats people when no one is watching." He let his words hang in the air. People glanced at each other, confused but curious. "I was thrown out," Shaq said simply. A ripple of whispers moved through the crowd. Some gasped softly. Others frowned, trying to imagine it. "Yes," Shaq said, nodding. "I was told I didn't belong. That I wasn't worth anyone's time. Not because I was rude or because I broke any rules, but because of how I looked." Eyes widened. Heads turned toward Richard, who stood off to the side like a shadow of his former self. His jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. Shaq's tone stayed calm but became sharper, clearer. "Here's the thing you all didn't know," he said. "I'm not just a visitor. I'm not a customer. I'm the majority owner of this dealership." The room froze. It was like time itself paused. Then came the gasps, the stunned stares, the sound of disbelief spreading like lightning crackling through dry air. "You, what?" one of the salesmen whispered. "You heard me," Shaq said gently. He reached into his folder and held up the ownership papers for everyone to see. The dealership's logo sat beside his name on every page, stamped and signed. "This dealership is part of my company. And starting today, it will run on something more valuable than money, respect." The silence that followed was different now. It wasn't shocked, it was reverent. For the first time, everyone saw Shaq not as an outsider but as the true leader of the place they worked in. Richard looked down at the floor, his pride shrinking like air leaking from a balloon. No one laughed at him, but no one stood by him either. He was alone, the way arrogance always ends. Shaq meanwhile turned toward the staff, his tone softening. "I know many of you work hard. I know you give your best every day. And I see that," he said. "But no matter how expensive the cars are, no one who walks through these doors should ever feel small. This will not be a place of judgment. This will be a place of opportunity." Some of the younger staff were quietly smiling now. A couple even clapped, hesitant at first, then louder. The energy in the room shifted, hope replacing fear. Shaq continued. "From today, customer service training will be mandatory for everyone from top to bottom. And community outreach programs will be part of your schedule. We're going to serve people who can't afford these cars, because kindness isn't about money." The word struck something deep inside them. By now, someone had recorded the whole moment on their phone. The video, Shaq standing in the middle of the dealership declaring ownership after being thrown out, was already flying through social media like wildfire. Within hours, it would be on trending pages. By night, millions would watch it. "Man gets kicked out of dealership, returns as the owner." It would become the headline that turned Shaq's act of quiet justice into a global story. But for now, it was just this moment. A once proud manager standing silent. A humbled staff learning a lesson they would never forget. And a man who had walked in as nobody yesterday, standing as the true boss today. Shaq finished with a simple line. Treat everyone like they belong. Because one day they might be the reason you still have a job. Then he turned and walked toward his SUV, calm as ever. No gloating. No celebration. Just the quiet strength of someone who didn't need applause to prove his worth. And as he left, everyone felt the same thing. They hadn't just witnessed an ownership announcement. The dealership had gone quiet after Shaq left, like the air itself was holding its breath. Richard stood frozen in the middle of the showroom, surrounded by luxury cars that now felt more like silent witnesses than prizes. The same staff who once followed his orders with quick nods now moved carefully around him, not meeting his eyes. For the first time in years, Richard felt small. His voice, once sharp and confident, was locked behind the heavy weight in his chest. His mind replayed Shaq's words again and again. You judged me without knowing me. This place will not make people feel small. Those words cut deeper than any punishment could. As the staff slowly trickled out for the day, Richard stayed behind, staring at his reflection in the glass wall. He didn't see the powerful manager anymore. He saw a man who had built his whole identity on pride, and watched it collapse in a single afternoon. And the worst part was Shaq hadn't yelled. He hadn't humiliated him. He had simply told the truth. That truth hurt more than anything. That night, Richard sat alone in his office. The desk that had once made him feel like a king now felt cold and empty. The dealership was silent except for the distant hum of the security lights. On the wall, the framed certificates of his top sales award seemed to mock him. He thought of all the people he had brushed off over the years, all the customers he had measured by their shoes or their accents. He remembered laughing once when a young man came in asking about financing, thinking he'd never afford it. He remembered telling an older woman she was wasting his time. He remembered the sting of his own voice when he had thrown Shaq out, saying, "These cars aren't for people like you." But Shaq had been people like him all along. And now Shaq owned everything Richard thought was his. A lump formed in Richard's throat. He had lost more than pride, he had lost respect. From his staff. From the board. From himself. For the first time, Richard didn't want to defend himself. He didn't want to be right. He just wanted to be better. Early the next morning, before the sun rose and before the first mechanic even unlocked the garage, Richard drove across the quiet city to a tall glass office building, the headquarters of Shaq's investment firm. He sat in the parking lot for several minutes, hands gripping the steering wheel, heart pounding like he was about to walk into a courtroom. Finally he got out. Inside, the receptionist greeted him politely. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Richard said, voice low. "But please, tell Mr. Shaq that Richard Collins is here. He'll know why." She raised an eyebrow but made the call. Minutes later, a tall security officer escorted Richard up a sleek elevator. The ride was silent except for the soft hum of cables. Richard's reflection in the mirror-like elevator walls looked like a man about to face judgment. The doors opened to a quiet, elegant office. Floor-to-ceiling windows bathed the room in golden morning light. And there, sitting behind a simple black desk, was Big Shaq, calm, composed, scrolling through a file. He didn't look up immediately. "Have a seat, Richard," he said without emotion. Richard sat. His hands trembled. "I came to say something," Richard began. "Something I should have said yesterday." Shaq set the file down and finally looked at him. His eyes weren't angry. They were calm, but heavy, like they could see through every layer of pride Richard had ever worn. "I'm sorry," Richard said. His voice cracked on the word. "I judged you," Richard continued, forcing the words out like stones. "I judged you the second you walked in. Not by your behavior. Not by your words. Just your clothes. And I humiliated you for no reason. I thought I was protecting the dealership's image, but really I was just protecting my ego." Shaq stayed silent, listening. "I see it now," Richard said. "The way my staff looked at me yesterday, the way they looked at you. I've been teaching them the wrong thing. I've been showing them how to chase money, not how to value people. And I'm ashamed of that." The word, ashamed, hung in the air like something fragile and heavy at once. "I don't expect forgiveness," Richard said softly. "I just don't want to be that man anymore. If you still want me gone, I'll walk out right now and never come back. But if there's even the smallest chance, I want to stay. And I want to do it right this time." Shaq leaned back in his chair. He didn't answer immediately. He let silence fill the space like water finding its level. Finally he spoke. "You know," Shaq said slowly, "when you threw me out, I wasn't angry. I was sad. Not for me. For what this place had become." Richard lowered his eyes. "But," Shaq continued, I believe people can change. If they're honest, if they're willing to work for it. The question is, are you? Richard lifted his head. Yes. I'll do whatever it takes. Shaq studied him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. Then start by listening, Shaq said. Not selling. Not proving. Listening. To your staff. To your customers. And to yourself. Because the only thing harder than building success is rebuilding your character. Richard nodded, eyes wet but steady. I'll do it. Good, Shaq said simply. Then let's begin. As Richard walked out of the office, the morning sun hit his face through the glass windows. For the first time in years he didn't feel powerful. He felt human. And that, somehow, felt like the first real step toward becoming something better.